One of the strangest and most striking things about the Imperium in Warhammer 40k is how much of it isn't futuristic at all. It runs on broken calendars, decayed technology, and kings that refuse to give up power. Honestly, it looks less like the far future and more like a history lecture gone wrong. Very, very wrong. In this video, we're going to dig into the forgotten civilizations that still shape the Imperium, and some surprising echoes from our own history. There are timestamps below if you want to check out any particular area. Also, please make sure to leave a comment if there is anything that I've missed. This list is far from exhaustive. I just want to go over a few areas that really struck me from reading the lore. Trying to figure out the exact time or date in the Imperium is always a difficult task. It would be difficult enough with any galaxy-spanning interstellar empire, but things are always a little bit more grim and dark in 40k. Mainly because the warp exists. I tried to go into detail on the calendar, but I would be spending nearly half of this video talking about what each of the different sections in the date can mean. I'm sure that there are other sources here on YouTube that can really help you out if you want to learn more about it. There exists an entire section of the calendar devoted to showing exactly how inaccurate it is. In the real world, of course, there have been plenty of inaccuracies in our calendars. It's why things like leap years exist. But expanding this possible problem out across the entire galaxy would give anyone a headache. I can only imagine the correction that would be needed in order to fix something like that. But the calendar used by the Imperium predates the Emperor unifying Terra. In fact, the Imperium didn't arise until the 31st millennium. This is the first real ancient influence on the Imperium that I can mention here. Its calendar. I'm not going to go into the changes that were made to it post-Great Rift. I'm going to strictly talk about the calendar that they used for most of their history. The exact methods used to figure out the date aren't known, but they were created by an ancient scholar who was famed far and wide for his reproduction of manuscripts and texts. In his long life, he managed to translate over 400 separate works. That might sound like a 40k character on the face of it, but this was a real person. A 6th century monk called Dionysius Exiguus. I hope I'm pronouncing that one correctly. His name was the Latin for Dionysius the Humble. Originally from the modern-day Romanian town of Constanta, he spent most of his life in Rome. His life's work was trying to find the date based on Christ's birth. The thing is, he was wrong. In 2012, the Pope even said that the current calendar is not accurate and doesn't accurately represent the exact year of Christ's birth. While the first year of this calendar officially marks 1 AD as the first year when Jesus was born, in reality he was more likely born sometime between the years 2 and 7 BC. So why did Dionysius, or Dionysius, or however you pronounce the name, use the year that he did? We don't really know. But he did create this calendar system in the year 525 AD. At that time, there was a fear among some people in the early Christian community that the world would end in the year 500. I could really go on for a lot longer about this guy. It's actually one of the most Warhammer 40k stories that I've come across in a long time. An old monk who lived 1,500 years ago who spent his life painstakingly translating texts, only to wind up creating a calendar that was inaccurate and still in use, at least in some ways, thousands of years after his birth. But the Imperium using this system isn't just funny. It shows how ancient mistakes can harden into universal tradition. That's the real story here. The dead hand of the past guiding the living. I like to think that at least part of the reason why they still use the current dating system in the Imperium is just how 40k the real world story is. A real world monk got the date wrong, either on purpose or by accident over 1,000 years ago, and now that system is used throughout the Milky Way. It's great stuff. But it also shows that sometimes these cultural traditions can become just accepted across different peoples. The calendar is one of the Imperium's oldest inheritances from ancient times, but it isn't the only one. Every world they touch carries the weight of history in stone, steel, and ruin. To see that, we need to look at the design and infrastructure used across the Imperium of Man. The Imperium's design and infrastructure is distinct. You can always tell when something was at least owned by the Imperium at one point. The high Gothic spires and the gilded flourishes are present on seemingly all Imperial worlds. This is the case across the whole galaxy. The Imperium makes its mark everywhere it goes, and it drives its presence home as much as it physically can. It doesn't matter what was there before. It all either gets subsumed or consumed by the Imperial machine. In the first novel of the Vaults of Terra series, The Carrion Throne by Chris Wright, We can see one of the main characters as they venture below the walls of the Imperial Palace itself on Terra. There they find the remains of whatever civilizations existed on Earth before the Imperium. These ruins were built on top of by the domineering Imperial government, both as a way of effectively building this new palace, but also as a way to show dominance over what came before. Architecture is power. Like in ancient Rome, Napoleon, or the British Empire, the Imperium builds things to show who is in charge. We can see something like this in the real world when it comes to imperial architecture and design. One of the most influential buildings ever made was the temple to Athena on the Acropolis in the center of Athens. This style of classical architecture was so influential that when the later Roman Empire was establishing itself, it considered this style to be supreme. It was quite common for the Romans to emulate the ancient Greeks when it came to culture, taste, and academia. These same styles were then replicated and emulated by later European empires. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris was created by Napoleon to celebrate his victories like the earlier Roman triumphal arches. The Wellington Monument in Dublin is still the second biggest obelisk in the world. The Irish-born general and later politician had their military victories immortalised in bronze that came from melted down French cannons. This emulated the Roman practice of taking monuments, like ancient Egyptian obelisks, from conquered parts of their empire. These monuments would then be displayed in public areas for all to see. There is also the European habit of intensely studying and building in these ancient styles. Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, originally developed in parts of the ancient Greek world, became the de facto style of architecture in Europe from the 1700s on. These different empires did this to harken back to these earlier empires. By studying how these structures were created, they were able to make things that hadn't been seen on that scale in centuries. This was done not only to impress, but also to establish legitimacy. When the Imperium finds uncontacted human civilizations, they tend to have little regard for whatever buildings were already there. They will essentially build on top of whatever else is there in their famous gilded Gothic-inspired style. Games Workshop has to make sure that people know somewhere is set on an Imperial world. Keeping the style the same is an easy and effective way of doing that. As to why this Gothic style is so prevalent, this style makes the Imperium feel more like a theocracy, a series of giant cathedrals basically. The Imperium of 40k also borrowed heavily from the Empire in Games Workshop's earlier setting of Warhammer Fantasy. Obviously, design isn't just cultural, it's also technological, and this brings us to the presence of STCs, or Standard Template Constructs. This was technology developed in the early years of human space exploration. Human settlers would have access to advanced STC technology that would help them survive in new colonies across the galaxy. But these designs would be standardized. My own reading of the lore is that these STCs might not have had this style at first, but over thousands of years of the Imperium becoming more theocratic, they gradually warped. To me, it's a nice reflection of how form follows belief. Now that I've mentioned design, I want to just briefly mention some of the more important infrastructure that the Imperium received from previous human civilizations. I think that I'll have to talk about things like STCs in another video. I'm sure it could go really deep down that rabbit hole alone. To my mind, one of the more interesting influences that the ancient world has given us was many of the systems of infrastructure that we still use. One of the things that the Roman Empire did best was road building. While today we usually build roads to last for a specific time, the Romans didn't necessarily know how to do that, so they often over-engineered their roads. This means that they are sometimes still around even today. While the claim that the axle width of their chariots still influences modern vehicles is likely a myth, some of their infrastructure networks in Italy, like the Appian Way, have become the basis of the road and rail networks used throughout Europe, and they still influence modern construction methods. In the far future, the Imperium of Man still uses many of the same methods of interstellar travel that were developed by previous human civilizations. In the early days of human interstellar travel, human ships struggled to travel far due to the severe dangers of the warp. But by the 22nd millennium, the navigator gene was discovered. We aren't sure if this was engineered or if it was a natural mutation. Either way, the navigator clans that exist in the current setting can all trace their origins back to this period of pre-imperial history. The first navigators were originally beholden to the service of others, be it industrial or trading cartels. Ultimately, they were able to establish themselves as a series of noble houses with a vast amount of wealth and power at their disposal. So whether it's roads that last thousands of years or navigators whose bloodlines go back nearly 20 millennia, like us, the Imperium still relies on infrastructure and systems started by those long gone. Like in the real world, in the Imperium, there needs to be someone in charge of things. So let's talk a little bit about imperial governments that have survived thousands of years. I'm not here to talk about the High Lords of Terra or the overall imperial government today, but there are governments on imperial worlds that can trace their ancestry back to the earliest days of human space exploration. Like the navigator houses, there are plenty of others among imperial nobility that can trace their ancestry back many millennia. Some of the best examples we have of this are on the Night Worlds. About half of these worlds will have allegiance to the Mechanicus, and about half to the Imperium itself. But they all still swear loyalty to the Emperor of Mankind or the Omnissiah. During the Dark Age of technology, humanity first reliably started to explore and settle the galaxy. The first great stellar exodus was called the Long March, where colonization ships set off to their pre-chosen worlds over the course of decades. Once there, ships were deconstructed and used as the basic raw materials to construct their new homes. These fleets were also given the first night suits to protect the new settlers. These are hulking weapons of war that are capable of great destruction. Only the god engines of the Titan legions are larger in scale. These knights were created to offer these early settlers a degree of defense against any threats from predators and xenos that they might face. Pilots of these night suits were carefully chosen. Not everyone was a capable candidate for their use. Over time, through connection with the suit's throne mechanicum, the mindset of these pilots gradually started to shift, but this took generations. With various members of a lineage using the same knight over decades, ideas like practical self-defense and communal survival started to fade. They were instead replaced with concepts like chivalry, martial honor, and also authoritarianism. Those that came under the protection of these knights over time became ruled by them. After the Imperium started to conquer the galaxy, many of these worlds then came to receive the benefits of being part of this galaxy-spanning domain. In the present setting, these worlds are often aligned with a nearby Forge world. They will provide it with much of the more basic needs like raw materials, food, and people, while the more industrious world provides necessary advanced tech and finished goods. While night worlds may at first seem like they're primitive, just like the European medieval-era feudal worlds, admittedly with more walking tanks, that's not true. These worlds are usually technologically advanced and produce plenty for the Imperium, but their political structures are purposefully kept as regressive and conservative as possible. In the lore, this is stated as one of the reasons why these worlds managed to survive for as long as they did, especially in a galaxy with as many horrors as that in 40k. In the real world, there aren't really quite as many examples of these sorts of power structures holding on to as much power for quite as long. I've made this point a few times already on this channel, but one of the most impressive things that the British ever did was to move their government away from positions of hereditary power. This meant that transitions of political power were far smoother, and they've managed to maintain these transitions for longer than almost anyone else in the world. But the British still do, quite famously, use titles, and they still have a hereditary nobility or aristocracy. While there's a pretty diverse set of landowners in the UK today, about 70% of the land in that country is owned by about 1% of their population. A good portion of these landowners can trace their ancestry back to the Norman invasion of England in 1066, and the current British monarch, a guy called Charles, is the 23rd grandson of William the Conqueror. For what is an objectively far more interesting example of a real-world monarchy that lasted, we can look at Tory Island. This is a tiny island off the coast of County Donegal here in Ireland. Supposedly, it was the one part of Ireland that the British were never able to conquer. The ancient Gaelic Irish aristocracy was pretty much gone by the 1600s, but Tory still has it, at least in some ways. We have evidence of the kings of Tory going back to the 6th century, but this tradition is probably far older. Unlike in regressive regimes like the Imperium of Man or the UK, the King of Tory Island is no longer a hereditary role. The position is currently vacant, but there will likely be a new one in due course. The last King of Tory was Patsy Dan McCreary, who died in 2018. There are dynasties that hoard land over generations. There are others that are only really ceremonial titles. Night worlds look more like the first case, power calcified through time and hereditary rule. Patsy, on the other hand, didn't interfere with people's lives or governance. He represented Tory to the outside world and, supposedly, welcomed every visitor that came off the ferry from the mainland. I think more of that kind of lineage is missed in the world. Not every lineage needs to harden and turn more authoritarian, but that sort of real-world trajectory doesn't really fit into the grim darkness of the 40k setting. But what about the larger governments? What are the ways in which they survived the current setting? There are really too many worlds that I could talk about here. I might have to make an entire video dedicated to that topic. But right now, I want to speak a little bit about just one of these governments, the Mechanicum of Mars. The Imperium of Man and the Adeptus Mechanicus are technically two sister empires. The Imperium is the senior in the partnership, but the Mechanicus is still vital to the survival of humanity in the setting. I and many other creators have spoken at length about the creation and early days of the Mechanicum and later Mechanicus, so I'm not going to go too much into that in detail here. If you want more information, click the link in the video on your screen or in the description below. The Mechanicus started on Mars in the aftermath of the Dark Age of technology, during the Age of Strife. It was initially a small cult that worshipped technology in the pursuit of knowledge. Later, when they met the Emperor, they started to worship him as the living embodiment of their god. They started as a struggling community, eking out a living in the ruined human habitations on the formerly terraformed Mars. The Mechanicum wound up colonizing the galaxy before the Imperium was even established on Terra. The early Mechanicum colonies weren't always able to keep communication between their different territories and their home on Mars. They also didn't have access to many navigators, which were mostly on Terra itself. When the Mechanicum found its way to Terra, they largely decided to ignore it. They thought that it was a barbarous place not worth conquering. They took what people and tech they needed and left old Earth alone. Upon their introduction to the Emperor, the Mechanicum decided to join the burgeoning Imperium. Unlike any other civilization that the Emperor's army seemed to have encountered, the Mechanicum was offered the chance to join peacefully and at a high level. Today, they are usually considered as an integral part of the Imperium. They are the Adeptus Mechanicus and are legally, functionally the same as any other Adepta, like the Administorum or the Astartes, only with even more autonomy. In the real world, there have been plenty of empires or polities that have merged together to form one overall political unit. In 1707, there was the first British Active Union that joined the two nations of England and Scotland. Similar to how the Mechanicus kept its autonomy, the Scots got to keep their church and some laws too. The subsequent United Kingdom was less a single nation and more a marriage of two. But there's another, older comparison I'd like to make, one that shows the sheer depth of the Mechanicus' influence on the Imperium: the Etruscans and Rome. The Etruscans were a people from central Italy that dominated the area between the 8th and the 5th century BCE. They had far more advanced technology than Rome, with urban planning, advanced engineering, and metalworking. They also had a complicated religious and political system. These were all things that eventually became incorporated into the later Roman Empire. The Etruscans faded as a distinct people with a separate political authority over time. But Rome was ruled by Etruscan kings before it became a republic. Eventually it established itself as an independent polity. But they still used the same alphabet, religious practices, and gladiatorial games as the Etruscans, and they used them for centuries. They even used the same symbol of the fasces, a bundle of rods, as a symbol of authority. The deal the Emperor struck with Mars feels similar to Rome in many ways. The Imperium took on many of the symbols, rituals, and beliefs of the Mechanicum. But while the Etruscans faded into Roman Italy, the Mechanicus never vanished into the Imperium. Right up to the current setting, every sacred ship, blessed bolter, and terrible titan has the holy cog of the Mechanicum. This reminds every subject of the Emperor that the Imperium is only a piece of the whole. The other half still, at least officially, belongs to Mars. And nowhere is the Mechanicus' influence clearer than its enforcement of one of the Imperium's strictest laws, the ancient taboo against AI. In the Imperium, AI doesn't stand for artificial intelligence. It stands for abominable intelligence. Say what you want about the setting, they can be very economical with their use of language when they want to be. We don't know a huge amount about the original human interstellar empire. In some sources, it's described as a confederacy. In others, it's described as something not too dissimilar from the Federation from Star Trek. From what we do see, I doubt it was a single political entity. It might have worked like the international structures today, loosely connected states that cooperate through shared norms, things like passports, even if they don't share a single government. The first human interstellar civilization probably functioned in a similar way, a group of loosely linked peoples that worked together when they needed to. One thing that almost definitely was seen across human space, however, was the use of artificial intelligence. We can see this through looking at the Leagues of Votan. They use AI throughout their society. Indeed, AI is considered a fundamental part of their culture. The Leagues of Votan are in some ways a more direct line to the ancient human interstellar civilization. Their origins come from the communities of artificially created humans that were sent out into space to colonize the galaxy and get it ready for subsequent human settlement. AI was used to help guide these communities through this process, and this culture has evolved and developed over thousands of years. In older 40k sources, these very early human colonists are referred to as the men of iron and stone, though GW's lore has blurred this distinction over the years. AI became a vital part of the human effort to colonize the Milky Way. But like what seems to always happen in science fiction, the AI rebelled against its masters. Shock, horror, surprise. We don't fully know the reason for the cybernetic revolt. Some fans have theorized that it had something to do with the warp's influence on regular humans. Regardless, this revolt devastated human-controlled space. This war ended the age of technology. Because it was so devastating, that era of human advancement has become known as a dark age by the Imperium in the current era of the setting. Mankind relied too much on machines and it led to devastation. As an aside, I think it really speaks to the general vibe of the setting that an age where humanity advanced the most and had the most scientific breakthroughs is regarded as a dark age. This revolt happened around the same time that psychers started to appear in the human population. After the war ended and humanity started to recover, these gifted individuals started to cause even more devastation on human worlds that survived. This next era, between the Age of Technology and the establishment of the Imperium, was called the Age of Strife. It lasted for about 5,000 years. Such was the devastation wrought during the cybernetic revolt and the subsequent era that artificial intelligence was outlawed across all human space. Even once the fractured remnants of this first interstellar community started to reunify under the Emperor, this ban against AI remained. In the current setting, the Imperium will use anything it can to avoid artificial intelligence. They will turn criminals into cyborgs called servitors and use the prevalence of psychers and other mutants to accommodate for the lack of any thinking machines. So, are there any taboos in reality that could be similar to this? Are there parts of our own past that were so devastating we still cannot bring ourselves to revisit the mistakes of our ancestors? The obvious answer here are things like weapons of mass destruction. Oh god, I really hope this taboo remains a thing when this video gets published, and forever ideally. Things like chemical weapons were used a lot during the First World War. By World War II, both sides had stockpiles, but nobody dared use them in battle. But both sides had a seemingly unwritten rule that they would only use these weapons if the other side did first, though admittedly, Germany did use them to an evil extent during the Holocaust. Today, probably the biggest taboo in the international community is against using things like nuclear weapons. They have only ever been used twice in the 1940s. Since then, their threat has been enough to terrify people around the world into restraint. These weapons were so devastating that their threat was enough to cause trauma for generations after their actual use. When countries do use things like chemical weapons or threaten to use more devastating ones, there is huge international backlash. Whole regimes have been toppled by their mere suggestion. Though in recent years, I've heard the argument made that more countries that feel threatened by their neighbours should start to obtain them. They might be a necessary deterrent against otherwise more powerful militaries. But hopefully, this taboo remains in place. I much prefer the taboo being against destroying ourselves with weapons too terrible to use, rather than in the Imperium, where the taboo is against making machines that make life a little easier. The Imperium runs on the dead hand of history. Every world, every law, every taboo seems to come from a civilization long gone. And that's not just Warhammer, it's our world too. If you want to keep exploring these echoes between fiction and history, subscribe. Check out my other videos and join the conversation below. In this channel, the past is never really past. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please make sure to leave a like and share it wherever you can. It all really does help. The last few videos I've published have had a major drop off in views, so I'm hoping that I can get over that going forward. Thanks a million for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one.